Did you know that one of the most beloved parks in Chicago, the one with the zoo, the one thousands of people jog through every single morning, is built directly on top of a cemetery, and that an estimated 12,000 bodies are still in the ground beneath it tonight, or that the nuclear age did not begin in a desert in New Mexico. It began in secret on a December afternoon in 1942 under the bleachers of a Chicago football stadium in a neighborhood full of sleeping families with no shield and no dome, or that when the government was finished with the reactor, it buried it along with the radioactive waste it made in a Cook County forest preserve where people hike and picnic today, behind a stone that says, "Do not dig." Chicago sits on top of its own secrets, not beside them. It's dead, it's garbage, an ancient sea, a buried river, and the most dangerous machine human beings have ever built. Most people in Chicago spend their whole lives looking up at that skyline. Nobody looks down, and down is where the city keeps everything it would rather you never found. We are counting down secrets that were buried, hidden, or paved over in Chicago that will change the way you see the Windy City for good, and stay to the very end, because what we saved for last is documented, radioactive, and still sitting in the ground 20 miles from the loop. Coming in at number 25, the neighborhood that is a garbage country. Here is what Hollywood never told you about the Magnificent Mile. The most expensive real estate in the Midwest is built on a pile of trash. In 1886, a con man named George Wellington Streeter ran his 35-ton steamboat onto a sandbar about 450 feet off the Chicago shore, and instead of leaving, he started charging contractors to dump rubble and garbage around it. The pile grew into 186 acres of made land. Streeter was a Union Army veteran and a former circus man, and he did not take eviction quietly. When a constable came to remove him, he chased the man off with a shotgun, and a court let him go free after a judge ruled that birdshot was not a deadly weapon. He printed his own deeds and sold pieces of the lake bottom to people who believed him. He declared the whole thing a sovereign nation, the District of Lake Michigan, and held off the Chicago police for 35 years. One raid in 1915 took 50 shots to clear him out. The Chicago Public Library still keeps the file. Today, the John Hancock Center, the Tribune Tower, and Northwestern's downtown campus all sit on his landfill. Every glass tower on the Magnificent Mile is built on a heap of trash a con man once tried to turn into his own country. Fact 24, the line that decides where the rain goes. Here is what nobody taught you about why this city is even here. Running straight through the metro area is the Subcontinental Divide, the spine that separates everything draining toward the Atlantic by way of the Great Lakes, from everything draining toward the Gulf of Mexico by way of the Mississippi. It is so low, it is now completely paved over. The National Park Service marks the spot at the old Chicago Portage, where a 6-mile swamp called Mud Lake once let a canoe slip between two ocean systems. In a wet season, a traveler could paddle the whole way across. In a dry season, they dragged their canoes through waist-deep mud. In 1673, the Kaskaskia showed it to Marquette and Joliet looked at that low, muddy gap and proposed digging a canal through it. That idea became the city. Explorers called this spot one of the keys to the continent. Chicago is not a city that found a good spot. Chicago is the good spot. The one place a canoe could cross America. Landing at number 23, the reef that should not exist. 20 miles south of downtown, beside the Tri-State Tollway, is Thornton Quarry, one of the largest stone quarries on the planet. 1.5 miles long, half a mile wide, 450 feet deep, and carved into its walls is a coral reef, roughly 400 million years old, older than the dinosaurs by 200 million years. The Field Museum has documented the fossils in it, the shells of ancient sea creatures that lived when Illinois sat near the equator. A section of that reef core still stands 300 feet tall inside the pit, and crews still blast the rock loose with explosives 3 times a week. And since 2015, part of that hole holds up to 7.9 billion gallons of Chicago's stormwater for the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. So 20 miles from the loop, there is a tropical reef older than fish with backbones, and Chicago is using it to hold back the rain. At number 22, the creek that has been boiling for 150 years. On the south side runs the South Fork of the South Branch of the Chicago River. Everyone calls it Bubbly Creek, and it earns the name. For decades, the Union stockyards used it as an open sewer, dumping so much blood and so many entrails into it that the water still bubbles methane and hydrogen sulfide to the surface today from the slow decay underneath. The sludge once grew so thick that people walked out onto its surface like ice and sometimes fell through. More than once, the gas on top of it caught fire. Upton Sinclair wrote about it in his book in 1906. I have stood on its bank, and the water moves like something breathing. The Army Corps of Engineers has a $15.4 million plan to fix it that has stalled for years over who is liable for the poison already down there. Chicago reversed an entire river to look clean, never managed to fix the one that still bubbles up the past. And hold on, because the darkest thing Chicago ever buried is not in this creek, and is in a forest 20 miles from downtown, behind a stone that tells you not to dig. We will get there. Fact 21, the building that invented the skyline. Here's what Hollywood never told you. The skyscraper is not from New York. In 1885, on the corner of LaSalle and Adams, the home insurance building went up 10 stories, 138 feet, and it was the first tall building in the world held up by a steel skeleton instead of thick stone walls. The architect, William LeBaron Jenney, supposedly got the idea watching his wife set a heavy book down on top of a birdcage and noticing that the thin metal frame held the weight. His steel skeleton weighed about a third of what a stone building that size would have, and that frame is the reason every tall building on Earth is possible. The Chicago Architecture Center will tell you the whole story, including the strange part. The title of world's first skyscraper was partly a public relations campaign that Chicago's own architects ran in the 1890s to make sure their city got the credit. In 1931, the building was torn down, so Chicago did not just invent the skyscraper. It invented the story that it invented the skyscraper, and then it demolished the proof. Coming in at number 20, the 4,000 wild animals living in the city with you. Every night, an estimated 4,000 coyotes move through metropolitan Chicago. The Urban Coyote Research Project at Ohio State University has tracked them since the year 2000. The largest study of urban coyotes in the world, more than 900 of them tagged and collared. They have followed coyotes denning in the medians of expressways. They mate for life, and in more than 20 years of tracking, the researchers have never once recorded an alpha pair splitting up. One of these animals walked into a sandwich shop in the Loop, climbed into the refrigerated drink case, and simply sat there among the bottles. And in decades of study, not one verified coyote bite of a person has been documented in Cook County, against 2,000 to 3,000 dog bites a year. There is a wild predator population the size of a small army living in this city right now, and it is far better at hiding than you are at noticing. And look, if a wild coyote can find its way into a downtown Quiznos and make itself at home in the cooler, you can find the subscribe button. It is a much smaller target. It is free, and I promise nobody on this team has ever been radio collared by Ohio State. Fact 19, the 5-mile city under the city. Beneath the Loop is a second downtown most Chicagoans have never fully seen. The Chicago Pedway, begun in 1951, when the city dug a single one-block tunnel to connect 2 subway lines, has grown into a network mapped by the city's own Department of Transportation that links more than 40 downtown blocks and over 50 buildings through about 5 miles of underground tunnels, lined with food courts, shops, and train stations the whole way. There is no single map posted at the entrances. The hours change from section to section, and people get genuinely lost down there. People walk the sidewalks above it every day and never find the stairs down. There is a second city beneath the first one, and most of the people standing on top of it will live their whole lives without going under. Landing at number 18, the day Chicago made the whole country reset its clocks. Here is something nobody taught you. Before 1883, there was no standard time in America. Nearly 50 different local clocks, each set by where the sun happened to sit over that town, and the railroads could not run a safe schedule across them. On October 11th, 1883, a room full of railroad men met at the Grand Pacific Hotel in Chicago and adopted a plan, drawn up by a railway editor named William Allen, that carved the continent into the time zones you still live by. On November 18th that year, a day they called the Day of Two Noons, clocks across America were reset to Chicago's plan. The Library of Congress holds the record. The reason 9 in the morning means the same thing in Boston as it does in Denver was decided in a Chicago hotel that no longer exists. And here's the best part. Chicago's own city government, at first, refused to go along with it. Fact 17, the wheel built to humiliate the Eiffel Tower. Here's what Hollywood never told you about the Ferris wheel. It is a Chicago invention, built out of pure national spite. When Paris unveiled the Eiffel Tower in 1889, America wanted an answer, and for the 1893 World's Fair, an engineer named George Ferris built the first one, 264 feet tall, with 36 cars, each one the size of a streetcar, carrying 60 passengers, for 2,160 riders at a time. It survived the fair and was later torn down with dynamite. Paris built a tower. Chicago built a machine to spin 2,000 people through the air, and then the whole world copied the wheel. At number 16, the room that changed surgery forever. Here is what nobody taught you about the blood in every hospital on Earth. On March 15, 1937, at Cook County Hospital, a doctor named Bernard Fantis opened the first blood bank in the world. Before him, a dying patient had to wait while doctors found a matching donor and bled them on the spot. Fantis, an immigrant born in Budapest, worked out how to store and preserve donated blood for about 10 days, and he coined the very phrase, blood you could deposit in a bank and withdraw when a patient was dying. In its first year, the bank made 1,354 transfusions. He published the method in a medical journal that same year, and hospitals everywhere copied it. Cook County Health still marks the date. Every transfusion in every operating room anywhere descends from that one room in Chicago. The city figured out how to bank human blood, and almost nobody outside it has ever heard the man's name. Fact 15, a year of death in a single night. On the night of October 4th into the 5th, 2023, 964 migrating birds died in a few hours, slamming into the glass of McCormick Place, the largest convention center in North America. The man who walked that building for the Field Museum had done it for over 40 years and found maybe a dozen dead birds on a normal morning. That night, he found nearly 1,000. Warblers, woodcocks, sparrows, the small bodies of a single migration wave that had hit a wall of lit glass on the lakefront. One Field Museum scientist called it a year's worth of death in one night, on what may have been the biggest migration night Chicago had seen in a century. By sunrise, the ground was a carpet of bodies. The lights had been left on. One Chicago building killed almost 1,000 birds in a night. And that is not even the secret we came here for. Remember that forest 20 miles out. What is buried there is not a body, and it is not a building. It is the most dangerous thing the United States ever made, and Chicago put it where families have picnics. Landing at number 14, the ancient sea you are standing on. The bedrock under most of Chicago is dolostone, the hardened remains of that same 400-million-year-old tropical reef, the very same one exposed down in Thornton Quarry, running in a sheet beneath the entire region. The fossils of dead sea creatures are inside the very stone the city is paved and built with. The Field Museum and the Illinois State Geological Survey put it plainly. There is, in one geologist's words, an immense story hiding under our feet. In 2022, the state made dolostone the official rock of Illinois. Chicago calls itself a young city. The ground it stands on is 400 million years old, and it is made of dead coral. Fact 13. The most American thing ever made. Here is what Hollywood never told you about McDonald's. The first restaurant opened in California, but the empire was built here. Ray Kroc was a milkshake machine salesman who saw what the McDonald brothers had built and bought the right to copy it everywhere. On April 15, 1955, he opened the first franchise in Des Plaines, in the Chicago suburbs, and turned one burger stand into a chain that now has roughly 40,000 locations worldwide. The original building is a museum today. California made the first hamburger stand. Chicago made it eat the world. And number 12, the deadliest city in America for a bird. Because Chicago sits on Lake Michigan in the middle of the Continental Flyway, with all its lights and all its glass, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has ranked it the single most dangerous city in the United States for migrating birds. Twice a year, radar tracks rivers of millions of birds moving over the city in the dark, and the lit towers pull them in and kill them by the tens of thousands. After that night, at McCormick Place, the building finally spent $1.2 million covering its windows in bird-safe film, and collisions there dropped by more than 90%. The fix had been known for years. Chicago is the deadliest city in America for a migrating bird, and it took 1,000 corpses in one night for anyone to turn off the lights. Fact 11, the sculptor Picasso refused to explain. In Daley Plaza stands a 50-foot sculpture of rust-colored steel, unveiled on August 15, 1967. Pablo Picasso designed it, refused the $100,000 Chicago offered him, and gave it to the city for free. Some 50,000 people gathered in the plaza for the unveiling. The mayor pulled the cord, the cloth dropped, and the crowd went quiet, because nobody could tell what they were looking at. And then Picasso never said. The Art Institute will confirm it. Nearly 60 years on, nobody officially knows whether it is a woman, a bird, a baboon, or Picasso's own Afghan hound. Chicago's most famous sculpture is a 5-story mystery, and the only man who could have solved it died without telling a soul. Landing at number 10, the tunnels under the lake that you drink from. Chicago's drinking water does not start at the shoreline. It is pulled from Stone Islands miles out in Lake Michigan, down through tunnels bored roughly 200 feet beneath the lakebed. An engineer named Ellis Chesbrough started it. The first tunnel was finished in March of 1867, dug by hand with picks and shovels, 2 crews tunneling toward each other from shore and from a crib 2 miles out, meeting in the middle under the lake within 7.5 inches of each other. 9 of these cribs were built. From shore, they look like little lighthouses or circus tents floating on the horizon. Crews of men called crib tenders used to live out on them in week-long shifts, alone on the lake, keeping the intakes clear. 6 still stand, 2 still work, feeding 4,300 miles of water mains. Every glass of Chicago tap water comes through a brick tunnel under the lake that men dug by hand before the telephone existed, and 2 of them are still running tonight. Fact 9, the square mile that fed America. Here is what Hollywood never told you about the food on your plate. For decades, the Union stockyards on Chicago's South Side processed more than 80% of the meat eaten in the United States, a single square mile that could hold 75,000 hogs, 21,000 cattle, and 22,000 sheep at one time. The conditions were so brutal that Upton Sinclair's 1906 book forced Congress to pass both the Meat Inspection Act and the law that created what became the Food and Drug Administration. The yards were torn down in the 1970s, but the limestone gate at the entrance still stands today as a National Historic Landmark, a stone arch leading into an empty field. The reason there is a stamp on your meat is 1 square mile of Chicago so horrifying that a single novel rewrote the law. At number 8, the prisoners buried under the ball fields. Here is what nobody taught you. During the Civil War, Chicago ran a Union prison camp called Camp Douglas, and the conditions inside it were among the deadliest of any prison camp in the war. Thousands of Confederate prisoners died there of cold, disease, and hunger, and roughly 4,000 of the dead were buried in the city's Potter's Field, ground that became part of Lincoln Park. The Chicago History Museum and the researcher Pamela Bannis have traced it. Some of those graves were never moved. There may be 4,000 war dead, the population of a small town, still in the ground under a North Side park, and almost no one walking it has any idea. Fact 7. The last grave nobody will open. In the middle of Lincoln Park, half hidden in the trees, stands a single limestone tomb, designed by the city's first professional architect, John Van Osdol, and built in 1858 for a hotel owner named Ira Couch, who had died the year before while on vacation in Cuba. It is the last marked grave left in the park, and it survived the Great Chicago Fire when almost everything around it burned. I have stood in front of it. It has not been opened in roughly 100 years. One workman who went inside long ago claimed it was empty. The family insisted 7 people were sealed in there. To this day, no one is certain who or how many lie inside. The estimates run from 1 person to 13, and no one can say why the city simply let it stay. There is a tomb in a public park that has kept its own secret for a century, and the city built the lawn right around it, landing at number 6, the object the airport tried to bury, on November 7th, 2006, around 4:15 in the afternoon. Roughly a dozen United Airlines employees, pilots, mechanics, supervisors, watched a silent metal disc hover over Gate C-17 at O'Hare. The cloud ceiling that day sat around 1,900 feet, and the disc hung silently below it before it shot straight up and punched a clean, round hole through the clouds. One pilot opened his cockpit window and leaned out to look up at it. The control tower had nothing on radar. United and the Federal Aviation Administration both said they had no record of it, until the Chicago Tribune forced the tapes out with a Freedom of Information Act request. The Federal Aviation Administration's official explanation was a weather phenomenon. It declined to investigate. A research group later studied it as a genuine flight safety event. A dozen aviation professionals watched a disc tear a hole in the sky over one of the busiest airports on the planet, and the official answer is a cloud. That is the real explanation. It is in the record. Fact 5. The 12,000 who were never moved. When the old city cemetery was closed in the 1860s, the removal was a disaster. Only a small crew of men did the digging. The transfer records were faked, and the Great Fire of 1871 burned the wooden markers off the graves so that no one could say anymore who was where. The researcher, Pamela Bannis, estimates that of roughly 35,000 people buried there, about 12,000, a full third, were never dug up and moved at all. In 1998, construction near the Chicago History Museum unearthed 81 skeletons and an iron coffin, and over the years, bones have kept surfacing whenever someone breaks ground in that part of the park. I have read her work, and the detail that stays with me is the simplest one. Bones still come up. They moved the cemetery. They just never finished. At number 4, the park that was a graveyard put it together now. From the 1840s until 1866, the southern end of Lincoln Park, the ground around the zoo, around the History Museum, was the Chicago City Cemetery. Around 35,000 people were buried there, many in mass graves during the cholera years. In one 6-day stretch in July of 1854, more than 200 cholera victims went into the ground at once. The Chicago History Museum documents all of it. The bodies that did get moved went out to Rose Hill and Graceland, the grand cemeteries on the edge of town. The ones who did not are still here, under the ball fields and the lawns and the lion house at the zoo, and then the city built a park on top of them. Every morning, thousands of people jog through Lincoln Park. Every single one of them is running over a cemetery. Fact 3. The captain who never came home. In November of 1912, a schooner called the Rouse Simmons left the Michigan woods loaded with about 5,500 Christmas trees, bound for the Clark Street dock in Chicago. Her captain, Herman Shu Nuch Mun, was known all over the city as Captain Santa. On November 23rd, a Lake Michigan gale took the ship down with every man aboard, somewhere between 12 and 17 of them. For weeks afterward, Christmas trees washed up on the beaches. A note in a bottle drifted ashore in the captain's hand. "Everybody goodbye," it said. "I guess we're all through. God help us." The families kept waiting at the dock anyway. The National Archives and the Wisconsin Historical Society hold the record. The wreck itself was not found until 1971 in 172 feet of water, and the hold was still full of Christmas trees. Every December, a Coast Guard ship still carries trees into Chicago in her name. The trees washed up for weeks. The families kept waiting. The ship is still down there, and so are the trees. Fact 2. The afternoon the world changed in a squash court. Here is what Hollywood never told you. The atomic age did not begin in a desert. On December 2nd, 1942, at 3:25 in the afternoon, the physicist Enrico Fermi and about 50 scientists from the University of Chicago triggered the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in human history inside a converted squash court about 30 feet by 60 feet under the west stands of the old Stag Field football stadium in a neighborhood full of people. 400 tons of graphite, 50 tons of uranium, stacked in 57 layers, going critical in the middle of a major American city. There was no containment dome and no radiation shield. The only safety plan was a few men standing on a platform with buckets of liquid cadmium, ready to throw it on the pile if it ran away from them. A young scientist named George Weil pulled the final control rod out by hand. When it worked, one of the men picked up a telephone and reported it to Washington in code. "The Italian navigator," he said, "has just landed in the New World. Argonne National Laboratory and the University of Chicago keep the record. The world has not been the same since. But the thing they left out of the history books, the thing almost no one in Chicago can tell you, is what happened to that reactor next. Because once it had served its purpose, the United States government took it out of the city, drove it 20 miles southwest, and finally, number 1, caution. Do not dig. In 1943, the men who built that first reactor decided it was too dangerous to keep inside a populated city, so they took it apart and moved it 20 miles southwest to a leased tract of more than 1,000 acres inside what is now Red Gate Woods in the Cook County Forest Preserves. They rebuilt the pile there, bigger, this time with a proper shield, and beside it, they built the first heavy water reactor in the country. That cluster of reactors in the woods became the beginning of Argonne National Laboratory. And from 1943 to 1949, the radioactive waste from all of that work was buried in a plot of ground right next door. Then the cleanup began. Between 1954 and 1956, the Atomic Energy Commission pulled out the fuel and the heavy water, shipped it to Tennessee, and took the reactors apart. The reactors themselves, decontaminated, then imploded, were buried right where they sat. The leftover waste was sealed under a foot-thick box of concrete. The whole site was seeded over with grass and handed back to the forest preserve. They planted a forest on top of the first nuclear reactor on Earth, and then people started hiking it. In the 1970s, the Department of Energy found tritium, a radioactive form of hydrogen, in the wells near the picnic area. A federal survey, with help from the United States Geological Survey, traced it straight back to the buried plot. So in 1978, they set a granite marker in the trees. It reads, "Caution! Do not dig. Buried in this area is radioactive material from nuclear research conducted here. There is no danger to visitors. United States Department of Energy." In 1998, they took down the fence and opened the whole thing for unrestricted recreation. Today, a bike path and hiking trails run right through it, and there is a picnic area beside the buried waste. I have stood at that marker. It sits a few feet off a trail where families ride bikes and lay out their lunches, and I could not tell you why a place that is genuinely safe needs a stone that begs you not to dig. Nobody I have read can either. The Department of Energy still monitors the groundwater out there for tritium and strontium-90. The reactors are still down there. The waste is still down there. Chicago buried its dead in a park and called it green space. It buried its waste in a creek and called it restored. And when it built the most dangerous thing in human history, it buried that in a forest, set a stone on top that says, "Do not dig," and let the families come. 20 miles from the loop, under a quiet stretch of woods where children are playing right now, the first machine that ever split the world open is still in the ground, and the only thing Chicago left to mark it is a stone, asking you, please, not to look.